everyone, welcome to the November 11th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking ahead to some weekend racing. Bit of a slow week in stakes racing, or at least graded stakes racing, as is always the case the week after the Breeders' Cup, just not too many big races scheduled. I was originally thinking we might take a look at Aqueduct on Saturday, but they had to postpone some other stakes races due to some wet weather in the New York area, so just looking around the country, we decided to land on Churchill Downs Saturday card, where they are running the Claiming Crown. I believe it's the first time they are holding the Claiming Crown at Churchill Downs, and we've got a series of starter allowance stakes races throughout the day, Craig, some big fields, and this is not an easy late pick five sequence to navigate.
No, it's full of big fields, as would be expected. Even a couple turf races, which we've seen very little of at Churchill. I think they carded one race recently, maybe. So that form's going to be a little iffy. And on top of that, I think it's actually pouring down rain at Churchill today. I'm sure they're going to want to try to keep these races on the turf, but it's good to keep in the back of your mind that it may not be a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, they've been using any available excuse not to use that Churchill Downs turf course recently, so we'll see. I think they ran one race on it last Thursday, I want to say. I haven't looked to see if they've used it so far this week, but really not a whole lot of usage for that course ever since that Arlington Million Day in the middle of the summer, so we'll see if they're able to get the races to stay on the turf this weekend. But like Craig said, it looks like it's a little wet there as we record this on Friday afternoon. This sequence does comprise 5 races to end the day, ending with race 11. The 7th race is the Claiming Crown Tiara. It goes on through the Ready's Rocket Express, the Rapid Transit, the Claiming Crown Jewel is race 10, and the Emerald is race 11. So we'll talk about those 5 races that end the Saturday card at Churchill Downs. And Craig, when I was originally looking through these PPs, I kind of wasn't realizing it was Claiming Crown Day, because if you're looking in DRF or TimeformUS, these races aren't listed with the normal names of the stakes races, and I wonder if that's because they're not calling them official stakes, so these horses can use Lasix, because I know if they term them as stakes races, they probably couldn't run on Lasix in Kentucky.
That's a really good point. I was wondering why it was listed that way. They're just listed as big purse starter allowance races, and really, if it is, it makes a lot of sense. We're talking about a lot of former claiming horses. Some will be claiming horses in the future, older horses that have been running on Lasix for a long time. So I personally have no problem whatsoever with that label.
Well, let's dive right into the sequence, and it begins with one of those turf races that we're hoping does stay on the grass. I don't think there are MTOs entered for these races. I'll take a quick look at my PPs. I know there's one MTO in this race, so obviously if this race came off the turf, you'd have to give strong consideration to that one. But on the turf, Craig, it does seem like we would have a clear favorite in this race in the number 4, Sunny One, who is just kind of one of these horses that does fit the starter allowance condition, because she did race for a claiming tag. If you go all the way back to May of 21, she competed in a $16,000 claiming race, but since then she's really come into some strong form, especially two-back, when she was only 2 lengths behind horses like Dolica and Princess Grace, who are graded stakes quality.
Yeah, I think she's a clear standout. I would be surprised if this race stays on turf if she's even as high as the 2-1 morning line. I will say she was obviously a very good claim. She ran back for a claim that first time back after the claim, but they survived that one, I believe. And she's been with us ever since in the allowance and starter allowance, just kind of beating up on a lot of horses, racking up plenty of wins. She took a shot in the Grade 3 Kentucky Downs Ladies Turf, was only beaten 2 lengths, and her last couple speed figures just kind of tower over the rest of this field.
They really do. She seems like a standout from a speed figure standpoint, and based on those class lines from two back. And even last time when she won that allowance race at Keeneland, she was beating a horse who was favored, Scottish Star, a Todd Pletcher trained runner who had won her turf debut pretty impressively at Saratoga in her prior start. So just seems like Sunny One is way the horse to beat, a horse that a lot of people might want to lean on in the first leg of this sequence. Craig, when I'm looking at others to consider in this race, my eye immediately goes to a couple of horses that are coming from New York. One of those is the number 7 Starship Malamar. The other, the number 12 Wicked Groove. They're actually coming out of the same race at Belmont at the Big A when they both finished behind Mr. Karas. That was just kind of a race that was dominated on the front end, both arguably a little bit compromised by the slow pace, though I would say the number 12 Wicked Groove arguably had the slightly worse trip because she had to go 3 wide around the turns.
The problem is she might have the slightly worse trip again, drawing the 12 hole, which is no real picnic. I would recommend, I haven't actually watched that turf race that was run at Churchill last week. I think it was, as you suggested, just one. There is one earlier on the card because if you remember when they did run on the turf on Arlington Million Day and even some races before that, you just had to be up near the front. Without it, you had basically no chance in those races. There was so much kickback coming back. So it's something I just didn't get a chance to check it out. But I would recommend people do that and watch the race that's on the turf earlier in the day and just kind of get a feel for how this course is playing. Because if that is the case still, which is really hard to say, that could make things a little tougher for Sunny One.
I did go, just out of curiosity, I went back and watched that turf race last week after the fact, and it seemed to play pretty fairly with regard to running style. Obviously, it's just one race, so you don't want to make too much of that with regard to track bias or anything like that. But, I mean, a horse did come up the inside from mid-pack to get it done, and more so what I was looking for watching that race was how the kickback was looking, because if you remember from that Arlington Million Day, they were just kicking up these huge clods of sod back at the horses in behind them. Maybe that had something to do why horses weren't really closing on that course. It was not nearly as bad in the race last week. Still some clods getting kicked up, but more normal than what we were seeing back over the summer. So hopefully the turf course really is in better shape for them to use it now, and we'll see if these races can stay on the grass. Craig, one more horse that I want to mention in this race that should be a much bigger price is the number 9 Bye Bye Birdie. Her most recent turf race might make people dismiss her because she didn't run that well in a Del Mar Stakes over the summer, the Oceanitas. She finished 10th that day. But that's a race that people might want to go back and watch because she got a ridiculous trip. I mean, she was 3 to 4 wide early, legitimately 6 to 7 wide on the far turn. I mean, it doesn't really even do it justice in the short comment. She would just had no chance based on where she was on the racetrack that day. She's got some prior turf races that really aren't that bad, kept decent company in California. She is the one that I would look to as a possible upset, or more so than those 2 fillies coming out of New York.
Yeah, I think it's hard to argue. She's probably a better horse on turf. I'm not sure why they run her so much on dirt. She is pretty good on both surfaces, but she tends to run a little better speed figures. So she's definitely one that has dirtied up form. I actually had a couple more horses I wanted to mention, and she was one of them. So I won't go too deep on her. You covered it. The other one was Peace with Honor. He's a horse she is a mare who is in really good form right now. Comes in with 3 wins in a row, ascending speed figures. Maybe the connections aren't quite, people won't be familiar with him in Kentucky as he's been running in the Mid-Atlantic, Laurel and Penn, but it's hard for me to resist the speed at a big price when she has such good form.
Yeah, when I'm handicapping this races, I'm also always looking at those TimeformUS race ratings, especially for races like this, where you have horses coming in from so many different directions and you want to compare the quality of some of the fields that horses were facing to what they're in today. So I do always kind of take a glance at the race ratings of horses' recent races, comparing it to the preliminary rating for today's race, which you can find up in the conditions in your TimeformUS PPs. And it does seem like Peace with Honor has been facing some slightly weaker fields recently, but like you said, she has gotten much better on the turf, and she clearly is in good form right now. Let's move on to the next leg of this Pick 5 sequence. Race 8, it is the Reddy's Rocket Express Stakes. This one is a starter allowance for horses that in the last couple of years raced for an $8,000 claiming tag. So we've got horses that could be at all levels in here, and this seems like one of the more competitive races in this sequence, Craig. It does feature the very likable, popular number 7 Beverly Park, who is unimaginably going for his 13th victory in 2022, which is kind of mind-boggling that horse has even gotten to the point where he's run that often to achieve that kind of record. But this is going to be no walk in the park for Beverly Park, because this is one of the toughest fields that I think he's faced in any of his 25 starts so far this season.
I would agree. And I was going to say, I don't know what's more impressive, the 12 wins or that this will be his 26th start. That's something we just don't see anymore. I think he's in pretty tough in this spot. Not that that's a big surprise. He's not like a big favorite on the morning line, a lukewarm 7-2. What really caught my eye in this race is, even though it's 6 furlongs, there is just an abundance of speed horses in here. And I don't know if that bodes very well for Beverly Park. He's not a need-to-lead front runner, but when you look through his PPs, he generally just runs okay when he doesn't make the lead. Those are the races where he just kind of hits the board, runs second, third, or doesn't really run. His best races come up near the front. And looking at the pace projector, I can't argue with it. It has him showed back as a co-6th, and he would really have to run to get up any closer than that.
Yeah, I agree with that. It seems like he's probably not going to get the kind of trip that he wants, and the majority of those wins have also been achieved at some lesser tracks. He did win at Churchill 3 back, and he ran fine at Keeneland 2 back, but a lot of his overall record has been padded by some victories at some lesser circuits, so I don't want to put too much into that. And when you just glance at his speed figures, it's not like he's any kind of standout in here, and I feel like just on reputation, he's going to take a lot of money in this race. So, Craig, I think, like me, you glancing at that pace projector, probably wanted to find some horses that can come from off the pace. And I've got to be honest, when I went through this field, it's hard to find too many that fit on form and also look like true closing types.
For sure. That is the problem. I went looking through trying to figure out who would be coming late. The one I landed on, and I won't say I had a lot of confidence, but I have to use it just because of the price, is the 9 Thirsty Betrayal. There's a lot of horses in here who are not really closers. He is one that probably is, but he's not one of those that drops 100 lengths back or anything like that. I think he's pretty solid. Normally, these are the kind of horses I would say he has to improve his speed figure, but he's run some triple-digit speed figures, which would put him in the mix. And if a lot of horses are coming back, maybe he wouldn't have to. Maybe the race just falls apart. Another closer that catches my eye is a local horse here in Oklahoma City, Crazy Legs Hirsch. The one issue with him is he has real problems getting out of the gate. There's no doubt he will be closing because he's going to be at the back. When he does get out of the gate, he runs nice speed figures. He's a horse who hasn't really been in a race with a fast pace in quite a while. But when he gets it, he does tend to show up. And at 20-1, I'll have him on my tickets despite those gate antics.
Yeah, we were both looking at those horses. I probably was a little more interested in Crazy Legs Hirsch, just because it seems like he does fit pretty well based on those races he's coming out of at Remington and particularly Sam Houston earlier in the year. But like you said, I mean, I watched that last race. He just hopped and literally walked out of the starting gate, and you never want to see that. He's probably going to be last here even if he breaks cleanly because he just doesn't have any early speed, but still, in a race that's this competitive, you don't want to give anything away at the start of a race. I'm going to mention a few more horses that caught my eye in this race, Craig. One of them is the number 8, Hero Tiger. He's not a deep closer by any means, but he at least is one of these speed horses that doesn't need the lead. He can stalk a little bit, so initially I like that. What I don't like is that he's got 17 second-place finishes to go along with the 7 career victories, so it does seem like he's one that sometimes comes out on the wrong ends of those close decisions, but he ran pretty well at Saratoga 3 back. That was a really tough race. That $40,000 claimer, Greeley and Ben, Happy Farm, Big Engine, they're better than almost all of the horses that he's facing in here. And since then, I think he's run fine in the 2 starts since getting claimed by the new barn, and he picks up Luis Saez. I think he's perfectly viable, and if that 12-1 morning line he holds up, he's one that I want to consider. And another horse that I want to take a look at is the horse all the way on the outside, the number 12, Don't Forget. Probably doesn't have the speed figure power of a few others in here, but he does have the right running style for this race. They're probably just going to take him to the back early, hope it comes apart, and if this race does fall apart, some crazy things can happen, and sometimes horses that look inferior on paper tend to do well in those situations.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was hinting at with Thirsty Betrayal. They look a little inferior, but when races fall apart, they don't have to improve, just run their race. So I have no problem with any of those. I did want to talk a little about the 10 powerfully built. If there was one real speed horse I was going to use in here, it would be him, just because he draws outside and he seems the one most likely to be able to avoid a duel, at least not be trapped in between horses, as the horses to his outside don't really have any speed at all. So the only thing I don't like is the 4-1 morning line, and it just seems to me like it's going to have to heat up front.
Yeah, the horse in this race I don't want at all is the number 1 Silver Moon Road, who just seems like he is committed to going from the rail. He's a horse that has been beating up on much weaker fields in his recent starts. He's one where you really want to pay attention to those race ratings. None of them are even in the triple digits, and he's been heavy favorites in those races, so he's going to be finding himself in a much more difficult spot than the races he's been in recently. I mean, he is looking as for his sixth victory in a row, so that's admirable, but it just feels like he's going to take money based on that, and not a horse that I want here.
No, me either. And the hope is he probably will take money, because you mentioned he has 5 wins in a row. And the one thing is none of them have been particularly close. I think the closest one was just under 3 lengths. He's had a couple of double-digit romps. So I would imagine there'll be some people that can't resist.
Let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, race 9. It is the Rapid Transit. This one is a 16,000 starter allowance race going 7 furlongs. And I guess you could accuse me of having some New York bias here, Craig, but I think the 2 horses that are coming out of New York, or particularly Belmont at the Big A, look pretty tough in here. The number 1, Ragtime Blues, who is coming out of a narrowly beaten second to the very good Amundsen last time, and especially the number 5, No Burn, who has just been in razor-sharp form ever since getting claimed by trainer Oscar Barrera, has just done an amazing job with that horse. They seem like they're coming in with some pretty strong credentials.
Yeah, and particularly for me, No Burn even more so, because he just has a pretty decent speed figure edge over Ragtime Blues, though that one has improved his number both times out, the last couple times in the new barn. So he'd have to improve a little bit more. Not a huge fan of the rail. So of those 2 New York horses, I do prefer No Burn. Unfortunately, he's the morning line favorite, I think, definitely lower than Ragtime Blues. But I do think he has a real edge in here. I guess there could be some concern about the cutback to 7 furlongs, but he's basically been running in a lot of one-turn miles, and I don't see all that much difference between that and the 7 furlongs at Churchill. I think he'll be just fine. He's a horse who doesn't really need the lead. He kind of he runs the turn really fast, and that tends to be a good thing for him. So he would be my top pick in here. I did want to mention a couple of price horses that I thought might have a shot. I'll start with the 3 First Glimpse. He's a horse who's turning back, hasn't sprinted in a long time, but it's just one, if it gets hot up front, he has speed figures that are right up there with Ragtime Blues. Admittedly, some of them came at Horseshoe, Indiana, but he did run well at Keeneland last time, winning a starter allowance, so I don't think he's a fluke. And another horse who's a much bigger price, but coming in for much cheaper tracks in Thistledown and Mountaineer and Mahoning Valley. Not that they're bad tracks. I mean, the racing has improved there recently with the better purse money that they offer. But he ran a really nice speed figure as well last time going the 2-turn mile. But those are 2, if the pace just gets really hot up front, I would want to use as like C's in this race.
Craig, was the second horse you're talking about so dialed in? I think you might have forgot to say his name.
Yes, the 8 horse So Dialed In. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I agree. They're both a little bit interesting on the turn back. If I was going to take anybody aside from No Burr, and that was turning back from route distances to the 7 furlongs, they'd be the ones I would look at. I couldn't quite get there because I know that No Burn, as well as Ragtime Blues to a lesser extent, have faced quality rivals in more recent starts, and I can't quite say the same about those 2 others, but like you said, they will be big prices. I guess my only problem with No Burn is he's 3-1 on the morning line. When I handicapped this race, Craig, he felt more like an 8-5 shot to me, so I wonder if he's going to get bet down a little bit too much. I guess a lot of that could depend on what they do with the number 9 Lieutenant Junior grade. He's kind of the wild card in this race because based on everything up until his last race, he's kind of like maybe a 10 to 12 to 1 shot in here. But his last race, I don't know where it came from, but it makes him one of the favorites if he can repeat it. I just don't know what to do with a horse like that.
No, I'm not sure either. And it was one of those tricky kind of slow pace races where he was up close and was able to get the job done. And then it was a huge gap back to third. He also does change barns, which in a race for me, like this for me, is a little bit of a negative. That's not really Thomas Van Berg's forte, first off the claim. But I would imagine that he probably took him with this spot in mind.
Yeah, he's an interesting horse in here, and one that I don't want to ignore. He just traveled well the entire way last time I went back and watched that race. I mean, he just looked like he was ready to run a big race from the time they rang the bell. And the horse that he defeated, Macron, he is a really nice horse. I think he had run, while I was looking in the formulator PPs, I know he had run a 100 buyer earlier in the year, winning a stakes at, I believe, Prairie Meadows. So he's a good sprinter, and Lieutenant Junior Gray just flat out beat him last time. So interesting horse in here. Don't quite know what to do with him, but if the public goes away from him a little bit, he might be one that you want to have on your tickets. And I guess the one big concern with no burn, Craig, going back to the favorite, is this is a barn that doesn't really ship. If you know Oscar Barrera, it's a barn that competes mostly in New York. You know, the past few years wins at like 8 to 10%. Has been on a pretty good run recently, especially with this horse. This horse in particular has been a great claim and padded that win percentage. But not a barn that has a whole lot of experience going to a circuit like Churchill Downs, and that might be a bit of a concern with a horse that is going to be a short price.
That is a concern. That's a great point you make. I can't remember seeing an Oscar Barrera horse ship anywhere. I'm sure there's probably a couple if I look it up, but I think he'd run some at Finger Lakes, but that's just kind of going with horses that don't quite fit on the NYRA circuit. So that's a good point, and certainly something to think about with a horse that's, as you say, I would suggest he'll be less than 2-1.
Yeah, and before we leave this race, I didn't want to go without mentioning the number 6 Family Man. He is the second choice on the morning line. I assume that's mostly because of his record at Churchill, where he's just 1 second place finish shy of being 5 for 5. So maybe that had something to do with the line maker setting him so short. But of the turnbacks, he feels like one to me that the 7 furlongs could be a little sharp for him.
I agree with that, and I also don't put a lot of stock in that Churchill record because as a speed figure guy, I would want to see him running better speed figures if it was truly he likes the track more than other tracks. I don't really see that. He's a really consistent horse. He ran similar figures at Ellis Park. He ran similar figures at Keeneland when he was running there around, the same he was running at Churchill. So I don't want to get too excited by that Churchill record.
Yeah, and he's a horse that has been racing up close to the pace in those recent route races, and if you take a look at the TimeformUS pace projector, you'll notice that he's all the way back in 9th position here, and this is another race that has a fast pace predicted, but for me, Craig, there's a big difference between this fast pace projection and the one in the prior race we just talked about, which had a plethora of front-running speed signed on. Not as many front-runners in here. I think it'll be a contentious pace, but I wasn't viewing this as a race that necessarily had to melt down.
No, all red flags are not created equal. Maybe we should have had some flames coming out of that one in the 8th race. This one's a little different. As you can see, we have the 8 horse so dialed in. It is right up there as a co-second, and he's a turn back. So that tells you it's maybe not quite the same level of speed.
Let's proceed on to what's often considered the feature race of Claiming Crown Day. It is the Claiming Crown Jewel, race 10. This is a $35,000 starter allowance race going the 1.125 distance, and probably the highest quality field that we'll see on Saturday at Churchill, Craig. We've got some horses in here that have run some pretty nice speed figures in recent starts. The rail horse Benevengo is coming off a big figure win last time out, although he's got some speed to deal with. And then you've got to make a decision about what to do with the number 5, Intrepid Heart, who is probably the best horse in the race, comes in with some impressive class and form lines, but he just loves to finish second.
He does. If I had to say there was one single on the card for me, it would be Benevengo. I know it looks like he might have some trouble up on the front end, but I think he's pretty good. And he really showed it last time. He was sent to the Wolves in the Haskell where he set the early pace, was a bit over his head. But what I really liked seeing was he was entered back just a couple months later in a $100,000 stakes at Pimlico. And it didn't seem like that Haskell had any effect on him. He went right to the front, was able to just draw away from the field through the lane. And the horse he beat is actually pretty good that day, Double Crown, who it took him a couple starts, which isn't a surprise because he's a Norm Cash trainee. But 2 starts later, we saw Double Crown at a huge price win the Kelso.
Yeah, that proved to be a better race than it looked at the time. My one concern with Benevengo is that he really did just get to control that pace last time, and there was another speed in that race, Seafoam, that was supposed to challenge him, and Seafoam just kind of blew the start and was always out of position, and that sort of allowed Benevengo to inherit the perfect trip that he got. And there is speed in this race that is supposed to press him. The number 3 Calibrator, he is a horse that really has to go forward in this race. I guess dirt is the big question for him because he's done all of his best running on turf and synthetic, so you don't really know. Maybe if he doesn't handle the dirt, he's not going to be as much of a pace factor as the pace projector indicates. But with him in the race, it's supposed to be a little more difficult for Benevengo, but I don't disagree, Craig. He's a 3-year-old that might be moving in a positive direction, and I initially was leaning against him, but the more I looked, I kind of couldn't toss him out completely.
And that was my thought on Calibrator is I just don't trust that he's really a dirt horse. Sure, he likes to go up to the front, but the synthetic races and the turf races don't really have the same kind of pace. Even when they're highlighted in red, they're generally not as fast as what we see on dirt. Those races are just done differently. So I just have a feeling he's going to be quicker and be able to put Calibrator away pretty early, and it's just a matter if he can hold off a couple of the others. I guess we should mention a few of those in here. You already mentioned Intrepid Heart. I have absolutely no knocks on him. He's a horse who always seems to show up, although, like you said, he doesn't win very often. But he's also a horse who kind of comes from off the pace or mid-pack, and you can scroll through his PPs for a long time before you get to any red fractions to show a decent setup. So I do think if Calibrator were to take to the dirt and be able to challenge the leader, that he would be able to be the one most likely to take advantage. A couple others I saw in here. I thought 12 Volt Man's last race for Safi Joseph at Gulfstream Park was fine. He ran a 110 speed figure. Same thing if it gets a little hot up front. He's one that could probably take advantage. And the horse right to his outside is in really good form too for Jamie Ness. I don't want to comment too much on him, but we know what he does with new horses. And he did it last time, first off the claim. The horse ran a huge 117 speed figure. I do wonder about him shipping the Churchill, though, and just how he's going to run. I know he won there 2 starts back, but that was for a different barn. I suspect it might be a little bit different for this trainer.
Yeah, I think Our Nation on Parade is a horse that we have to talk about in this race because he's looking for his 5th victory in a row. He's been in great form. He's got speed figures that rival those of Intrepid Heart recently, as well as Benevengo. So, I mean, he makes a whole lot of sense in this race. I don't know what to make of Jamie Ness shipping to Kentucky. Even though the horse has experience here, Jamie Ness hasn't started a single horse on the Kentucky circuit in the past 5 years, if you look that up in Formulator. Although he does sometimes ship horses around to other circuits, he generally has most of his success at this racetracks that he's primarily based at, like Parks or when he has strings at Laurel. That's where he typically, cleans up and collects most of his wins. What I will say about Our Nation on Parade is when Jamie Ness gets a horse to improve off the claim, they generally hold that for him for at least a few starts. I looked it up in Formulator. Second off the claim with horses that won first off the claim, he's 39 for 115. That's a 34% win rate with a 203 ROI. So that's a pretty good ROI for some last out winners because horses that won their last race typically take a lot of money. So interesting horse that's a little difficult to assess in here, but I think is one that you do have to be afraid of. Craig, one more horse that I do want to mention is the number 7, Tis Ride Time. If you're looking at this pace potentially being favorable to Intrepid Heart, you probably also have to look at him as another closer in here. He hasn't competed at allowance levels or, stakes races that are quite as high as Intrepid Heart, but I thought he's faced some decent fields recently, particularly 2 back behind Open Road and Strong Quality, who are decent runners. Probably has to get a little faster, but if things come back a little bit, he's one that should be running late.
Oh, for sure. And his speed figures aren't that far off of some of the others. He has back-to-back 111s the last couple races out. We have talked about some horses on the outside here. I do think that's a little bit of a factor at Churchill, but at this mile and an eighth distance, it's not so much as if they were running a mile and a 16th. You get quite a bit of a longer run into the turn.
Yeah, and I'll just say I didn't quite give my full opinion on Intrepid Heart. He's been in great form, as you said, has kept really strong company. I mean, Twilight Blue, who he faced two back, he's a really nice horse who has turned into one. The horse that beat him last time came back to win the Fayette Stakes against a really nice field at Keeneland. So his form lines are unquestionably tops in this field. It's just he does have a little bit of that seconditis feel to him, so you want to be aware of that with a horse that could be a short price. Craig, let's move on to the final leg of the sequence, the Claiming Crown Emerald. This is back on the turf course, going the mile and the 16th distance for the males. $25,000 starter allowance race is the condition for this race. And this is one where you can probably narrow it down to a few horses. Not necessarily the strongest race in terms of horses that are dropping out of really tough spots, but I think you do probably have to start the conversation with number 11, Freedom Matters, who did win a high-level optional claimer last time at Kentucky Downs. That was one of the better races he's run in his career, and now he's got to try to transfer that form to Churchill. Sometimes easier said than done to go from a big effort at Kentucky Downs to a different racetrack, but he does have some prior form to back that up.
Yeah, he had wins at Colonial and also at Gulfstream on the turf, sandwiching an off the turf race where he didn't run very well in the synthetic, but I have no problems with him other than the post. I think that could be a little difficult in a big field like this. He's a horse who has some early speed, but he's not really a true front runner. So Edgar Zayas is going to have to work out a trip with him from the outside. Now, I do think, while I think there is some filler in here, horses who probably aren't contenders, I think there are some others that are just as good.
Yeah, and we both agree. Freedom Matters is just an obvious contender in this race. I'm not sure how short I'd want to take on him because of that post position, as you mentioned, but he is definitely one to consider, and he's got that versatile running style where he can be up close or in mid-pack that should be well-suited to giving his rider some options in here. We do have to talk about the pace a little bit, Craig, because it's another fast-paced flag. You're going to see that generally in races that have large fields, like all of these Claiming Crown races do. The number 3, Driftwood, who showed on the lead, is kind of a tough horse to really have an opinion about here, because if you go all the way back to last winter at Tampa Bay Downs when he was running on the turf, he was right there with horses like Sherrill Spite, Wolfie's Dynaghost, Good Governance, all horses that would be heavy favorites in a race like this, but he's been competing on synthetic since then. Now he's first off the claim for a barn that doesn't really have great numbers doing this. I'm just not sure what to do with him.
I wanted to make him my top pick based on those prior dirt races and the fact I do think he'll probably be clear on the lead. When you look at the PPs, even though it's a fast pace, he's on a clear lead. We show red flag alert, the one horse a couple lengths behind. And he's not a real speed horse. He basically presses fast paces, but he almost never leads his races. And then the 10 Karam is shown after that. He's another one. He's just not really a leader. He led last time in a dirt race and folded, so I can't imagine they do those tactics again. So I do have a feeling he's going to be up front. I just had a hard time getting by the barn change. And, maybe I just don't know enough about him, but I know in the TimeformUS, first time in a new barn, the rating for this trainer is a 2. It's on a small sample size, but we don't have many that low. So I would be a little bit against this one in here, even though I initially liked that he's probably going to be alone on the front end. Couple others I took a look at, and the horse I'll probably lean on the heaviest is the 9 Big Agenda. He's just a horse who seems to be in really good form since he got claimed from Rabatris. Actually, there's a couple claims in there. He got claimed from Jeremiah Engelhardt a couple back. And whatever Joe Sharp is doing with him, he's turned him around because he's running some nice speed figures. He had a really poor pace setup last time and still was able to get up and win, got a 108 speed figure. It did get a little bit of a boost because of the slow pace, but not a crazy one. And it just showed me he could handle, if it's a fast pace, I think he'll be okay. If it's a slow pace, he'll be fine. And I think he's the one to beat, personally.
Yeah, he's fine. I mean, those $25,000 claimers that he was running in at Aqueduct, they're decent fields, and he ran well to win last time. And I guess it is a good sign that Joe Sharp is doing well with him again. He's actually had him in the barn before. He won with him, I think, back at Belmont in the spring, claimed him back after that. So you always like to see that when a barn kind of has an affinity or does well with a horse. So I think he makes sense in this spot. I'm not sure how short a price I'd want to take on him, but maybe he will be a decent odds with that number 11 Freedom Matters in here. Another horse that could take money is the number 4 One Night Standards. And Craig, he's just the kind of horse that I'm not quite sure that the improvement last time was legitimate because it was going a mile and a half. At Keeneland, it feels like he's a horse that might have really moved up with the added distance, and his races going shorter, they don't quite put him on the same plane as a few of these. So if he's going to be the second choice here, or even the favorite, actually, he's the morning line favorite at 5-2. I missed that. He's one that I would want to downgrade a little bit.
Right, and we've seen time and time again, Mike Maker likes to claim these horses, as he did this one 4 or 5 races back, and he likes to run them at these longer distances, which he did last time. He ran fine at Keeneland to be third, but I'm with you. I think it was more the distance, and it's just a case where he just kind of fits in this race, so why not take a shot? But I don't want to take a shot when he's probably going to be the first or second choice.
I've got 2 more horses I want to throw at you, Craig, and maybe you can tell me I'm crazy. Probably more so with one than the other. The number 10, Karam, who you mentioned with regard to the pace situation, I agree. He's not a horse that really wants to be that forward, but he does have that tactical speed. This horse has plenty of back races that make him a major player in here, and obviously his form went the wrong way, and it went the wrong way when he was in the Safi Joseph barn, who obviously wins at a high rate, so maybe that's a bit of a negative sign, but doesn't it kind of feel like his last race when they ran him on the dirt was just a prep? I mean, he came back in a $32,000 claimer where they withheld the claiming tag. It was waived, I should say, which they have the right to do when a horse is coming off a layoff. And they just got that race into him over a surface that really is not his preference. Now they're running him in this much more ambitious spot, going back to the turf. This could be a horse for Eddie Keneally, second off the layoff, that really takes a big step forward. I thought he had a bit of a sneaky look to him in here, and he's one that probably will be a price. And the other horse, Craig, that is going to be a gigantic price is the number 6 Bear Oak, who has just one turf race in his career. And I would say if it looks bad on paper, go back and watch that race. That's just a replay that might be worth viewing. Because the comment line, I would say, doesn't really describe what happened. I'm not going to describe what happened, but you can go watch it and kind of decide for yourself, because I really don't know what the jockey was doing. But I will say, once the horse straightened away on the stretch, I liked the way he was moving over the turf, even though it seemed like there wasn't an intention to win the race. And ever since then, he's been in decent form on the dirt. Obviously not quite up to this level, but I just find it a little interesting. They've never run him back on the turf since then. He's got a big turf pedigree on the bottom side. His dam was a stakes winner on the turf. She ran a 98 buyer on the turf. And this horse is the kind of horse that has the turf move-up pedigree that I'd usually like on a younger horse. And, maybe on a 5-year-old, it's too late to make this switch, but he's going to be a gigantic price. And just given the things I observed in his one prior turf race, I would want to include him somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not going to call you crazy, and I have not watched that replay, but I will. I will note that they did try to run him on turf 3 back. It got taken off the turf at Belterra, a race he was able to win. But what's interesting to me is his speed figure that day on the turf was a 94. It kind of fit right in with his dirt races, just a hair lower, and I'm assuming he had a terrible trip, which I will go watch. So maybe he will like the turf, and I would never call anybody crazy for liking a 30-1 shot, because when you hit those, you just don't want to ever try to, not that you would listen to me anyway, but you don't ever want to try to talk someone off of a 30-1. And Karam, same thing. I have no problem with Karam. I think that last race is a line through. Yeah, my only comment on him is he's not really going to be fighting for the lead, but I do think with his speed, he could get pretty decent position. So the 10 post isn't as big of a concern for me with him.
Well, Craig, we've gone through this entire sequence for the listeners to kind of make this a little bit easier to digest. Let's just briefly go back through and kind of go over how we might construct our tickets. I'll let you go first, since I've just done a lot of talking.
Okay, I'll be honest. There's no way I'm going to play a pick five in here. I'm going to play vertical bets with the horses that I like because it's just not a sequence that I would ever feel comfortable about thinking I had a shot to hit. So for me, it's just not a good bet. I think the races are good betting races themselves. So the first race, if I were playing, I would probably lean very heavily on the 4, who looks like she's a good one, and then use exactas with the 6 and the 9 horses who I think can do better on the turf than what we've seen. I shouldn't say that. Peace with Honor's been doing fine on the turf, but I just think they're going to be a little bit under bet, so I would use those 2 with the favorite. In the 8th race, let me see. I was definitely looking for some closers in here. I know we talked about a couple of them. I landed on, if I had to make a top pick, it would be Thirsty Betrayal. But this is a race where I am going to spread. The other one we both talked about was Crazy Legs Hirsch, a horse who has trouble getting out of the gate, but if he gets out of the gate, that would be great. If he doesn't, I still don't think it totally eliminates him, because this is a race that's just going to get crazy on the front end, I think. I would. It's not often I can be really confident there's going to be a speed duel up front, but I think this is going to be one for sure. In the 9th race, I'm with you on leaning on the New York horses. I'm not sure I would bet this race individually. No Burn and Ragtime Blues both look fine. I personally prefer No Burn a little bit more than Ragtime Blues. And the other horse I mentioned was So Dialed In on the turn back. If for whatever reason No Burn finds himself shuffled a little further back than he's used to at 7, I think So Dialed In offers a little bit of a juicy price for a horse that's really in pretty good form. In the 10th, I would definitely lean on Benevengo. I really liked this race at Pimlico last time. I think that was a stronger race than what people see. And even though Calibrator is a horse who looks like he has some speed and has actually shown a little bit in front, I'm a little bit skeptical of that because he just doesn't run on dirt. And then the last race, the 11, I think personally Big Agenda is the horse to beat. But if I were going to play a pick 5, but I'm not, as I said, I will play some verticals though. And I would use some of those horses that you mentioned. I would also use, I tossed Driftwood, but I would definitely use Karam, the 10 horse. I would begrudgingly use Freedom Matters because he's just a good horse right now. And you've talked me into going back and watching the Bear Oak replay. And even without it, you made a really good case for him.
Yeah, kind of what Craig was saying. It's a tough sequence to put together a pick 5 ticket for. At least it is for me, because I have some long shot opinions throughout, but they're not the kind of horses I would want to lean on really heavily because they're just such contentious races that I don't have great confidence in them. And even in the other legs, they're not horses, even the shorter prices, that I would want to narrow down too much because, I mean, I don't want to lean on horses that could be underlays, especially in races where I don't really feel that strongly about anybody. So like Craig was saying, it might be some races I want to approach more from the vertical standpoint, play some win and exacta wagers. We'll see. But if you can afford to put together a pick 5 ticket, it seems like a sequence that could pay pretty well. I'll just go back over some of the races that Craig mentioned. In that first leg, I would just narrow it down to 2. Obviously, the favorite Sunny One, who we talked about, is legitimate, and the number 9, Bye Bye Birdie, that horse that I thought had the interesting trip in her last turf race. I would use those 2, and then moving on to the 8th race, Craig and I have a similar opinion here. Just went to some slightly different horses. I'm pretty interested in the number 8, Hero Tiger. I think he could trip out in this race, and I like his recent form. Craig and I both were on the number 11, Crazy Legs Hirsch. And then the number 12, Don't Forget, just another closing type that fits the race shape really well, even though he looks maybe a little inferior on form. I would use all 3 of them. And Beverly Park, he's a horse that I guess if you want to throw him in defensively just because he loves to win so much, you could, but I don't think you're really getting rewarded in the price department with that horse. Moving on to the 9th race, the Rapid Transit. I agree, No Burn, much the horse to beat, not against him. I would use the number 1, Ragtime Blues, who probably doesn't have as solid form as No Burn, but does seem to be coming into this race doing pretty well right now. And then the other horse to consider is the number 9, Lieutenant Junior Grade, who ran that big race last time, and I don't want to just dismiss it as a fluke because he really did beat a good horse that day. So a little bit chalky for me in the Rapid Transit. And then moving on to the 10th race, the Claiming Crown Jewel. Again, I didn't have particularly clever opinions here. I think that Intrepid Heart and Our Nation on Parade are probably the best, most reliable horses. But again, you still have questions. I mean, Intrepid Heart not loving to win, Our Nation on Parade going out for that Jamie Ness barn. I respect where Craig is coming from on Benevengo, and he's not a horse that I want to let beat me, but I do have a few more questions about how legitimate his last race was. And I guess I was going to throw in one long shot. It would be the number 7, Tis Right Time. And then closing things out in the Claiming Crown Emerald. Freedom Matters is fine. He makes a lot of sense to me. I'd say the same about, the number 9, Big Agenda, though to a lesser extent. I think he's coming out of some slightly weaker races. And then those 2 long shots that I do want to use and horses that I might play, just win or exacta bets on, keying around them. The number 10, Karam, and the number 6, Bear Oak, that horse that I think is going to be a pretty big price in here. So that's a look at a very complicated Claiming Crown late pick 5 sequence at Churchill on Saturday. And, Craig, a lot to go through in that one.
Yeah, and I hope people don't mind when we say that it's not really a sequence that we liked after we're the ones who picked it out the handicap. But I do think the races are very good. But for me, it just wasn't a sequence that I would put my money on, and I want to be upfront about that with people. And we do still do the work. I know both of us do, and we want to give the best opinions we can. So I didn't want to make people feel like I'm giving them opinions on races I'm not going to bet. I am going to bet the races for sure, just not the pick 5.
Yeah, I echo those statements. And yeah, I hope nobody expects us to just, come on here for 2 minutes and give out a caveman ticket and say, okay, we're done. Because that's not what this podcast is. We're trying to give ideas that you can use, angles from which to view these races that maybe will give you the insights to craft tickets, mixing them with your own opinions. I think that's what we're trying to do here. Just have a discussion about the races and maybe get the gears turning in your head in a different way that will allow you to hit these plays. We're not going to sit up here and tell you exactly what to play, but we're just trying to get you to think about these races in a different way. Or if you haven't done a lot of handicapping yet, maybe just find an entry point from which to start looking at these races. So that's the objective, at least how I view it for this podcast, our TimeformUS Forecast.
And the other thing I wanted to say, at my suggestion, I believe David and I are going to be taking a little bit of time off from these podcasts. It's just after the Breeders' Cup. I think we're both pretty worn out. We do a lot of stuff at DRF, a lot of race previews, a couple podcasts a day. And this is just a slower time for racing. So I think we're just going to bring it back right before the Cigar Mile, do a forecast for that card at Aqueduct, and just get back into the swing of things after that. Maybe take even a little more time after that. It's just a slow time of year, and that's the way it goes in horse racing. And then pick back up with when the Malibu gets going after Christmas.
Yeah, nothing's changing. I mean, these podcasts are going to continue on at the start of next year, as they always do, 2 a week. But Craig and I don't take too many breaks throughout the year. So given that it's a slow time, I think we're going to look to just kind of recharge our batteries a little bit, because especially after the Breeders' Cup, I mean, if you're working on the daily grind, you can get to start to feel a little burnt out. So, I mean, I'm sure you guys don't want that as listeners, so we'll just take that time for ourselves to maybe focus on some other things for a little bit, and we'll be back fresh and ready to do handicapping and talk about all these races with our usual enthusiasm, of course, later this year, but also moving on to 2023. So thanks for giving people the heads up about that, Craig. Remember that you can always hear these podcasts in the past or moving forward on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Craig, thanks as always, and listeners, thanks to you for tuning in as usual. Everybody, make sure to catch our future notifications about when the next podcast will be. Craig and I are going to sit down and discuss that a little bit, but certainly Cigar Mile Day, as Craig said, we'll do a preview for that grade 1 and stakes laden card at Aqueduct. So make sure to tune in then, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.